won't it? You know, we're talking right now in our society quite a bit about the rule of law, lack of rule of law, lack of respect for the law, all these different things. I want to look at this a little bit. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 4. The prophet Isaiah actually prophesied of our time, and it made this point. God was inspiring Isaiah for our day, but it's Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 4. I'm going to cite the Amplified Bible version here. No one sues righteously, but is the editors of the Amplified note, but for the sake of doing injury to others, to take some undue advantage. And that's often the case of lawsuits these days. Yeah, no one sues righteously, but for the sake of doing injury to others, to take some undue advantage. And no one pleads his case in truth, but rather they trust in empty arguments and speak lies. They conceive trouble and bring forth injustice. Then if you just skip down with me just a few verses later here in Isaiah 59, he comes back and he pushes this whole subject of justice a little more in the legal system, the problems of the legal system. He says, Isaiah 59 and verse 4, justice is pushed back, and righteous behavior stands far away. You know, this is what happens. When justice is pushed back, then righteous behavior that would be approved of God, good behavior, stands far away. For truth has fallen in the city square, which is the city square in antiquity. That's where, you would debate things. That's where you talk about things. That's where people would get together and talk things over. But it's saying, for truth has fallen in the city square, and integrity cannot enter. Yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. The Lord looked and was displeased to find there was no justice. And that's really, in many cases, this is describing our time right now. Because truly, if you stand up for the truth in the city square, in the marketplace of ideas right now, you find that, you're going to find that you're going to be attacked. And this is what we have, this whole thing of cancel culture. This is the idea. Justice is pushed back, and righteous behavior stands far away. For truth has fallen in the city square, and integrity cannot enter. Yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. And the Lord looked and was displeased to find there was no justice. And for this reason, in many ways, our justice system has been, and is coming and will come increasingly into disrepute. Now, the news that we see, that you can hear if you're getting your news on your social media sites or websites, or maybe a legacy media source like newspaper. Yeah, I still read the newspaper. It shows me things I otherwise wouldn't click in on a website. The news sometimes highlights a problem that we see in our contemporary legal system with all its laws and its regulations, all the things that we go into, because our legal system is vast. We're not just talking about what, we have all this administrative law these days, as well as, we have the health department. They're constantly making new legal pronouncements. You can do this and that. You will get fined if you don't do that, whatever it is with the COVID stuff. Now, recently here in Canada, we had some prominent, some criminal trials back east involving horrific terrorist violence. Now, this violence in one case was only planned from that standpoint, but in the other it was carried out. And it drew a massive amount of media coverage here in Canada. And the trials themselves were costly, and both in time and money. It took a long time. Anything going through the courts these days takes an incredible amount of time. And however, eventually the prosecutors did their job, and they ended up the juries returned a verdict of guilty to these two people who were planning or carrying out terrorist attacks here in Canada. But later on, the lawyers for the accused appealed to this, and the appeals court tossed out the convictions due to some obscure legal rules about how Canada's legal system uses what they call lay triers to determine if there was bias in the jury, the people who were selected for the jury. Because Canada's legal system selects, when they get a jury pool, they'll select a couple people to look at the other people in the jury and try to determine, are they biased, and oftentimes they'll look at them, such decisions, these people, is somebody biased? They'll make their decisions by the appearance of the person, the demeanor of the person, or maybe it's just plain hunch, or maybe they'll say something and they don't believe them. Whatever it might be, we have a weird process here in Canada about determining whether a potential juror has a bias or not. So, anyways, the appeal courts said this was they ascribed to the judge's decision of how they selected the jurors. They said it was an error in law, and they required the case to go back to trial at additional great expense, tying up the court's additional time, only to result in the convictions one more time. Now, in the U.S. courts, for Americans who are listening to me, prosecutors and defense attorneys have much more leeway to question and strike potential jurors from being selected in a particular case, much more so than we have here in Canada. And they do this always, ostensibly because of suspected bias from this standpoint. But the situation in the United States is such that's far from alleviating bias. The U.S. practice has, historically and for some time, to many observers, this simply made it worse. Defense lawyers and prosecutors, they've been known to racially stack juries in ways that favor their side of what they're trying to get, the results they're trying to get. Now, our contemporary legal system is, besides being strange and sometimes just, this whole thing ascribing to somebody bias and all this sort of thing, our legal system that we have right now is often ineffective at trying to solve the problems that the laws were passed to try to fix or to enforce or to encourage. Now, we have the case of a Calgary tax lawyer named Patrick Lindsay, who, he's been in practice for quite some time. He was forced to relitigate a similar case that, on a similar point of law that he had won 30 years earlier. But the federal, revenue agency, the Canada Revenue Agency, our version of the Internal Revenue Service. Anyways, they didn't seem to care, the bureaucrats there, or they weren't interested in following the legal precedent. They just also allowed this particular case of an educational tax credit. Because we had a law and that was passed into the Income Tax Act, and I can give you, paragraph 118.2, section 2, verse, how the law is, that allowed parents, anyways, to claim 15% of a tuition for sending a child to school who had a, quote, unquote, mental impairment. So it would cover 15% of the tuition to, in this case, a specialized private school to help this student. And of course, as you could well imagine, when you get into the legalese and the bureaucratic and the way the tax, they want to say, okay, how is he mentally impaired? Do you have tests? Do you have experts saying it? Do you have all this sort of stuff? Is this really impairment? And of course, Lindsay, had to fight, like he had fought the case, something very similar 30 years before. He had to relitigate it for this new client at a considerable cost, I might say, because as you know, lawyers are not cheap. justice, quote unquote, going through our legal system is not cheap. And you have to have a lawyer to do it, really to do it well anyways. The lawyer who relitigated, he won the case a second time. And he got his clients he got his clients out their educational tax credit, so they got it, but I don't think they saved any money. I think they lost all sorts of money to do this. But he's concerned because he's thinking, well, these bureaucrats at this government regulatory agency, in this case, the Canada Revenue Agency, they come and they go, and either they like this or they don't like that or whatever it might be. And sometimes they force you to relitigate it. And this is a problem oftentimes with workers' comp problems, too. This is a whole situation where the people who are trying to take advantage of, what our system allows, you'll find others that say, well, then they have a different agenda. No, we don't want to allow this for whatever reason. And, to get justice, you have to relitigate, time and time again. Now, our contemporary legal system is also often arbitrary. And accompanied with it being arbitrary, sometimes it's strangely illogical. And this is, part of the contemporary scene of what we've got right now with COVID and all its restrictions and fines. Here in BC, why, we have a regulation now passed that you can only have 5 people. If you rent a condo on a lake or something, you can only have 5 people over one time. Oh, why 5? Where did they get the number 5? Or any of the other numbers? They come up with some of these things. Now, there is a case, COVID restrictions back in Ontario, in Ottawa. There was a teenager who was fined $880 for violating Ontario Health Department regulations, bylaws, when the bylaw officer found him playing basketball by himself. Okay, without a mask. Which is craziness. It's illogical. If there's nobody around you, you're more than socially distanced. If you're the only person on a basketball court, how in this world is this do it? It's illogical. And then there was a story in the Oakville, Ontario father who was fined $880 for taking his 3 sons out rollerblading. I believe it was in a park. Maybe they didn't have masks on too. I have no idea. His 3 little kids, out, whatever. Whatever. And then we had, famously here in Canada, in one of our prairie provinces, Saskatchewan, in Nipawin, the provincial health authority threatened to fine a church because they held a religious service in which they had everybody of their congregants drive in their cars with the windows rolled up, park in the parking lot, and listen to a Wi-Fi broadcast sermon while they were sitting in their cars with their windows rolled up, listening to this sermon. It's crazy making. It's illogical, but yet, they were threatening thousands of dollars of fines. Now, sometimes, of course, it seems like our contemporary legal system can be silly in some ways. 5 years ago, though, the water laws in the state of Colorado in the United States of America were so strict that if you wanted to collect rainwater, in a rain barrel, coming down the downspout and whatever, that was illegal. You could be fined because you were stealing water. They finally changed it. Okay, they decided that, this course came out and it became somewhat of a big deal, and there's, we have more environmentally conscious things, and they finally said, all right, we're going to change the law. So now if you live in the great state of Colorado, you can collect rainwater up to 2 rain barrels worth of total of 110 gallons of water, and we're going to say it can only be used on this property, and it can only be used outdoors. I mean, we've got to specify all this stuff. Our contemporary legal system is sometimes also blatantly corrupt, and is being written with loopholes or laws passed that, what's, in the public interest is rather channeled to private interest, the private interest of mega corporations, or, the wealthy, or politicians, or career bureaucrats, whatever it might be. We have here in BC, case in point, the BC rail scandal of a few years ago. In 2004, the BC Liberal government that we had at that point in time passed a law that privatized the assets of BC Rail, which for 100 years has operated as the third largest railway in Canada, BC Rail. Third largest railway in Canada. They privatized it, leasing out, I guess, or really it was selling off from that, all the stock, the rolling stock, and everything else. They legally they retained ownership of the tracks and the land beneath the tracks, but the law gave a proponent who bid for the right to have this essentially something that was forever. I guess it was 999 years, which is just 1 year short of 1,000 years. The government gave to the Canadian National Railway the use of everything, all the equipment, all the stuff, and the right. As I said, this was the third largest railway, and they just did it on a process that there was a rival bidder called Canadian Pacific, our other large railroad up here. They said, they've stated that, this bidding process for this deal that the Canadian Liberal government was offering was rigged. Was rigged. And it turns out that Canadian National, CN, what we call CN up here, is one of the Liberal Party of BC's biggest donators to their political fund. They've given them over $320,000 as of up to last year. Well, the BC Liberal government, of course, said they had to do it. All these things, okay, but they were telling falsehoods. It was a money-making fair that was given off and sold off for a song from that standpoint. And some of the people who leaked the bidding documents, who took bribes and were convicted of this and had to pay back I think one was $75,000, all these different things. Sometimes our contemporary legal system is absolutely corrupt in how we do things. Our contemporary legal system can be unfair or discriminatory in either how its creation of these laws or regulations or application. And when a wronged citizen, when a citizen is accused of something, okay, and they've been accused, and if they're going to clear their name, they've got to go to court, or they've got to go before a tribunal of some sort and fight that unfair or discriminatory or misapplied law. But even in fighting, sometimes even if they win, they are in effect still losing. We have the complicated case of inside trading scandal, stocks and this sort of thing, where the regulator accuses a company executive of doing inside trading. He said, "You're nuts." Not at all. He had to defend himself. He did defend himself with, successfully. But the regulator, the Ontario Security and Exchange Commission, made him pay their legal expenses as well as his own legal expenses. And if you have any idea of how much money is involved, he won the case, but he lost big time, from this standpoint, on how much it cost him. One of his lawyers said, it's a one-way street. These laws, if you're accused of something, the threat of fighting it and the cost of fighting is so large that oftentimes he said that many of his clients will simply feel coerced into making some sort of settlement or acknowledgement of guilt when they have none. There are all sorts of administrative tribunals in this country that can do that have that power to make you, if you fight it, you still have to pay. Let's go to Isaiah 59:4 one more time. "No one sues righteously, but for the sake of doing injury to others or to take undue advantage. And no one pleads his case in truth, but rather they trust in empty arguments and speak lies. They conceive trouble and bring forth injustice. Justice, verse 14, is pushed back, and righteous behavior stands far away, for truth has fallen in the city square, and integrity cannot enter. Yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. The Lord looked and was displeased to find there was no justice. Our contemporary legal system is often unfairly targets groups and ideologies favoring one over another. You know, it's well known that in this country, a mother is well favored over fathers in custody law. The rich are favored over the poor. You know, justice is the best that you can afford. We have in Canada what we call Bill C-16, which was passed a few years ago, which amended the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. And it added to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act the concept of gender identity and gender expression. To even question this political ideology could be construed in some legal arenas these days as some form of hate speech. And this was the reason, and the whole cause for Professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto, why he mounted his whole defense, and he became one of the better known speakers and writers, probably maybe even the best known here in Canada. And there are other Canadian laws like Bill 16, such as Bill C-14, that allows, and these days is even construed to mean coercion of doctors and nurse practitioners in the healthcare system into legally killing Canadians when they are requested to do so. Otherwise, they face discipline, from their administrative, college that administers them, and they can go in and defend themselves. But even if they win, they still have to pay all the legal costs. Yes, our contemporary legal system too often gives the general concept of law and the rule of law a bad name. It is, in many different ways, and people realize it. That justice is not blind, it's oftentimes partial. And it's very hard to access unless you're a multimillionaire. But this is not a new problem. The problem of justice and establishing justice is not a new problem. It actually turns out to be a very old problem. It's a problem we've had for a long time. I want you to turn with me to 1 Kings. We're going to go into the scriptures and look at a case the Bible talks about, of how justice being twisted and being manipulated and the justice system being used, for purposes other than what it ought to be used for. This is 1 Kings 21. We have the whole story here. Now it came to pass after these things that Naboth of Jezreel, which is in the northern part of the modern state of Israel, had a vineyard in Jezreel, near the place of Ahab, king of Samaria. So in real estate, location. So he had his vineyard, and it was right next to one of the royal, palaces from the standpoint. And King Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, "Give me your vineyard, so that I may have a garden of vegetables, of herbs, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard than it. And if it seems good to you, I'll give you the worth in silver." So I said, "Well, sell to me. All right, we're going to have, I will either exchange it and give you something else, or I'll give you the money for it for something like this." But the thing was that Naboth, in the land of ancient Israel, they had inheritances. The family had a piece of land. It wasn't encumbered. They didn't have to pay taxes on it. They only had to pay taxes on what they produced on it, according to the law of God in the ancient Israel. But the king was saying here, and you know how kings are. I'm the ruler. Give me your piece of land, and it's like expropriation these days. We require that. I mean, if you have a property and the state wants it, they can say, "You're going to give it to us whether you like it or not. Well, we'll pay what we think it's fair value." And then people can sometimes argue in the courts for years about this sort of thing. And Naboth said to Ahab, "Far be it from me by the Lord that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers to you." I've had my vineyard. It's been in the family for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think by this time it was probably be about 500 years. That's a long time to have a place. And he was standing, he was on his rights, but Ahab was king. And Ahab came to his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers, which was his legal right. And he lay upon his bed, Ahab, and turned away, and he was pouting. He was pouting, and his wife Jezebel, who was a pagan Phoenician, came to him and said, why is your spirit so sad, and you are not eating food? And he said to her, because I spoke to Naboth of Jezreel and said to him, give me your vineyard for silver, or if it pleases you, I will give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. And his wife Jezebel said to him, do you rule over Israel? Are you in charge of the government? Are you in charge? Rise up, eat, and let your heart be merry, and I will give you the vineyard of Naboth of Jezreel. And then she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. She did all the legal documents. Okay, you put his seal on it, which was, that is, this is the official law. And sent the letters to the elders, to the nobles in his city dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letter saying, proclaim a fast and set Naboth on high among the people, and set 2 men, sons of Belial, that is, sons of the devil, before him to bear witness against him, saying, you blaspheme God and the king. Then carry him out and stone him that he may die. And the men of his city, the elders and the nobles, this is the elders, these were the judges, these were the people responsible for administering justice in his city, did as Jezebel had sent to them, as it was written in the letters that she had sent to them. And they did exactly that. They proclaimed the fast, and then they had these guys come together, and they made false accusation, and they had Naboth killed. And once you're stoned, in this case with real stones, there's no going back. They chased off whatever his sons that they didn't kill, and he took Ahab got his land. He took it. He didn't have to pay for it even. But you can read the rest of the chapter on this, and you will see that God noticed that this was a perversion of justice, because the king was to be the chief legal officer in Israel. He was the judge of final resort. You think of Solomon, in all the cases, the king would be the one who would make the final judgment on things. And he should have been administering justice. Instead, he was using the law to serve himself. In this case, commit murder by false accusation, false testimony. This is breaking one of the commandments, bearing false witness against somebody. Maybe, from this was exactly what it's designed for. And God eventually said, okay, you did this. God was going to hold Ahab and Jezebel accountable. You can read the rest of 1 Kings 21 and see exactly what he said, and you see how it came out. Yes, our contemporary legal system too often gives the general concept of law and the rule of law a bad name. But as I said, this is an old problem. Let's go and see one more case here. The Bible makes it a very specific case of law being used inappropriately, self-interestedly. This is Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, that they might be over the whole kingdom. These were administrative as well as to make sure the legal system was in operation. They were the governors. And over them were 3 presidents. Daniel was one of them, the administrative format, so that these satraps might give an account to them, and the king should not suffer loss. So over the 120 satraps, there were people, I guess they were probably, if you logically divide it, 40 each. And so you had 3 people who would keep an eye on everybody else, make sure they were doing their job. And then you have Daniel. Daniel, as we know, I mean, there's a book in the Bible written by him as he was a prophet, he was a righteous man. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the presidents and satraps because of a surpassing spirit was in him. And the king was planning to set him over all the kingdom. He was going to make him his vizier. Remember, this is the Median Persian kingdom. Then the presidents and rulers sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. So they were looking for dirt on Daniel. These were politicians. And there was politics, the Persians and the Medes to say, oh, we got this Jew. We don't want him, one of these, refugees from Judah from this standpoint telling us what to do. But they could find no occasion of fault in him because he was faithful. They couldn't find any corruption. He wasn't pocketing money. He wasn't taking bribes or any of that sort of stuff. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So what did they do? They had to figure out a way how to make the law of the land to get Daniel, to get this righteous person. Then the presidents and rulers assembled to the king and said this to him, King Darius, live forever. Okay, you get these types. And all the presidents and the kingdoms and of the kingdom and the prefects and the satraps and the officials and the governors have planned together to establish a statute and to make a strong decree that whoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, except from you, O king, he shall be thrown into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the writing and the decree. And when Daniel had learned that the document had been signed, Daniel went to his house, and the windows were open in the upper room towards Jerusalem. And he kneeled on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did before. See, he had his freedom of religion. He had a relationship with God. And you prayed. That's one of the things you do as a person of God, is you talk with God. And so they were saying, they knew, we're going to get him, that we're going to find grounds to accuse him. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel praying. They came near and spoke before the king concerning the king's decree and said, have you not signed a decree that every man who shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, except of you, O king, shall be thrown into a lion's den? The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. And they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is of the exiled children of Judah, has not respected you, O king, nor the decree that you have signed, but makes his prayer 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard that these things, was very much displeased with himself. He knew he had been tricked. See, they had come to him and they had represented one thing, but the law was really designed to do something else. Oftentimes, there can be laws passed. They say one thing, but they have another purpose. This is nothing new. And he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. The king did, and he labored until evening, and the men came before the king and said, O king, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree or statute which the king established may be revoked. So, of course, he had to. They forced him. He knew he had to. They'd caught him. They maneuvered him into this position where he's having to throw his good friend whom he trusted and knew to be an honest man into a den of lions because they had used the law as a weapon to get him, Daniel. Of course, God intervened. And you can read the rest of the story to see how this worked out. But in this case, it worked out in Daniel's favor, for sure, and not in the favor of his false accusers. During the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, during the first century in this era, there was a group who were religious leaders of the community who also administered law from that standpoint. They misused God's law. They were misusing it because they were corrupt. They wanted to enhance their prestige, their status, as well as their bank account, if you want to put it that way. And they had God's law, they knew God's law, but they wanted to turn it to their own benefit. Let's go in the Gospels, let's go to John chapter 7. Gospel of John, chapter 7. I'm going to read this in the Coulter translation. Gospel of John, chapter 7. Now, after these things, Jesus was sojourning in Galilee, for he did not desire to travel in Judea because, the Jewish leaders, those in charge of the religious establishment and the state, were seeking to kill him. Now, the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was near. So this was in the fall. Actually, the Feast of Tabernacles is getting near again. We're a little more than a month away from it. For this reason, his brothers said to him, "Leave this place and go into Judea so that your disciples may see the works you are doing, because no one does anything in secret but seeks to be seen in public. If you are doing these things, reveal yourself to the world." For neither did his brothers believe in him at that time. Some of his brothers, James and Jude, would later be leaders in the church, but they weren't at that time. They weren't believers. Therefore, Jesus, big brother, you know how it is with families. Anyways, therefore, Jesus said to them, "My time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify concerning it that its works are evil." Yes, if you speak up against some of these things, the world isn't going to love you for it. Didn't then either. "You go up to this feast. I am not going up to the feast now, for my time has not yet been fulfilled." And after saying these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up, Jesus also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret, because he knew the situation that he was in. As a result, the Jews were seeking him at the feast, said, "Where is he?" There was much debating about him among the people, and some said he is a good man, others said, "No, he's deceiving the people." However, no one spoke publicly about him for fear of the Jews, for fear of the religious authorities. It wasn't PC to talk about Jesus. They would kick you out of the synagogue, which was making you a social outcast, which would have also business as well as social repercussions. But then in the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and was preaching, and the Jews were amazed, saying, "How does this man know letters, having never been schooled?" He'd never been to one of our schools. Well, the Spirit of God had taught him. Jesus answered and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me." This is one of the big differences. Jesus was teaching, it wasn't his, it was teaching what his Father's, God the Father's doctrine. If anyone desires to do his will, he will know the doctrine, whether it's from God or whether I am speaking of my own self. The law that I'm talking about, all the things of how you should order your life, are they mine? Are they just my opinion? Or is this what God the Father has in mind? If anyone desires to know his will, he will know whether the doctrine is from God or whether I speak of myself. The one who speaks of himself is seeking his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. He's not self-dealing. He's not self-serving. He's not twisting the words of God and the law of God for his own benefit. Does not Moses give you the law? And yet none of you is practicing the law. Why do you seek to kill me? These people made a boast that they were the interpreters of the law. But Jesus was, you're not doing the law. You're not practicing the law. None of you. Which is an amazing thing to think about. These people, they made such a big boast that they were living and administering God's law, but they weren't at all. Let's go to Mark, the Gospel of Mark. Pick up a little different aspect of Jesus working with the Pharisees. These people who were the legal system and operating the legal system of his day. Mark chapter 7, and we'll go verse 1. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes from Jerusalem came together to him, to Jesus. And when they saw some of his disciples eating with defiled hands, that is, unwashed hands, they weren't doing it the way that they wanted to. It's just, like now we're supposed to wash our hands for 20 seconds with the COVID thing and sing a little song or something. They found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews holding fast to the tradition of elders do not eat unless they wash their hands thoroughly. So they had a separate system of law that they had set up, their traditions, their oral law. And even when coming to from the market, they do not eat unless they first wash their hands. Well, yes, if you come from the market in these days, we're told to wash your hands. I do wash my hands. This is just a smart move to make. And there are many other things that they have received and observed, such as the washing of cups and pots, brass utensils and tables. Yes, they had all their cleaning protocols. For this reason, the Pharisees and the scribes questioned Jesus, saying, "Why don't your disciples wash according to the tradition of the elders and eat bread with unwashed hands?" These days you might say, why aren't they wearing a mask or something like this, right? And he answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy concerning you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me." See, they're paying me lip service. They're saying, oh yeah, we're righteous people, we love God. But Jesus saying, that's not what your motives are. "But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men." So they weren't teaching God's commandments, God's law, God's statutes in the way he had presented it. Instead, they were teaching their twist on it. Verse 8, "For leaving the commandment of God, you hold fast the tradition of men, such as the washing of pots and cups, and you practice many of the things like this." You think that this is righteousness. Many people seems, are you making a religion out of the COVID-19 protocols of all the different stuff? I don't know. And, that's up to you to decide what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Then he said to them, "Full well do you reject the commandment of God so that you may observe your own tradition," your own twist on the law. You reject the commandment of God, which tells you what's righteousness, what is holy, what is good in God's sight, and instead you replace it with your traditions, which is what, of course, our legal system here in Canada and in the United States most certainly does. For Moses said, "Honor your father and mother, and the one who speaks ill of father and mother, let him be put to death." But you say, if a man shall say to his father and mother, "Whatever benefit you might receive from me is Corban," that is, set aside as a gift from God. So instead of taking care of you when you're retired and when you're old and giving you this financial support, I can just say I can give it to the religious authority as a gift from God, and I don't have to take care of you anymore. And he's not obligated to help his parents. God said, he held the children responsible to take care of their parents. And he excused them from doing anything for his father or mother. Nullifying the authority of the word of God by your tradition you have passed down. You practice many traditions such as these. And so this was the issue. People will look, instead of following the law of God, what the law of God says, instead they follow their own traditions. With sickness and disease, somebody who is sick, they would be in quarantine. You didn't quarantine an entire healthy society. You quarantined the people who were sick. Just as a contemporary example from that. Let's go to Matthew 23. Matthew 23. See, Jesus had a real problem with those who were sitting and administering the law in his society because they weren't doing it in a godly fashion. They were doing it for their own benefit, for their own reasons, for their own agenda. In Matthew 23, verse 1, we have, and Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in Moses' seat of authority as teachers of the law, as administrators of the law. They are administrating the legal system. And then he says this to them. He says, verse 3, so practice and observe everything they do to you, but do not do as they do, for they preach things but do not practice them. The scribes and the Pharisees tie heavy loads that are hard to bear and place them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not lift a finger to make them lighter. This is why sometimes it gets to be a little rich when you see a leader who's saying, we have to do all these things, and even the modern COVID protocols, and then they ignore them themselves. It bothers people. But he says, Jesus goes on, they do all their deeds to be seen by men, these Pharisees, for they make, their religious observance, so their do-gooding, phylacteries in this case, or tefillin wide, to make them more conspicuous, and make their tassels long. So they like to look good. They like to do the things that look good. And they love the place of distinction and honor at the feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and public forums, and to have people call them teacher, rabbi. But Jesus said, don't fall into this trap. Don't fall into that trap yourself. He goes on, verse 16, and here he says, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears an oath by the sanctuary of the temple, that is nothing, non-binding. Okay, so God's house, if you were saying, okay, I promise, we still have people when they go to court, they swear on a Bible. These days they could do a Quran. I think the Aboriginals have something they do, burn sweetgrass or something. But whoever swears an oath by the gold of the temple, in other words, he's got money involved in it. That he's obligated. He has to keep that promise if it involves money. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the sanctuary of the temple that sanctifies the gold? And you scribes and Pharisees say, whoever swears an oath by an altar, that is nothing, it's non-binding. Whoever swears an oath by the offering on it, costs money, it's obligated. He's a debtor, he's got to fulfill his promise. Then he goes on and he makes this point. You spiritually blind men, which is more important, the offering which you're giving to God, or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Something that was made according to God's law. Therefore, whoever swears an oath by the altar swears by both it and the offering on it. Whoever swears an oath by the sanctuary of the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears an oath by heaven swears by both the throne of God and by him who sits in it. What are you self-righteous scribes and Pharisees? They're setting up their own standards of what is righteousness, what is good, what is politically correct. You hypocrites, you're going to, you give your tenth, in this case, in this society, of all of your herbs, your mint, your dill, your cumin. You're focusing on these minor manners and have neglected the weightier or more important moral and spiritual provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the primary things you ought to have done without neglecting the other things. It's kind of like in our society right now. We ignore totally the sanctity of life issues, and we focus on social distancing and wearing masks. God's ways are different from our contemporary legal system. God's law, his teaching, which is what Torah in the Hebrew means, when correctly applied, it has none of the inherent drawbacks and problems that comes from what we see with our contemporary modern legal system, with its injustice, discrimination, ineffectiveness, illogical nation, foolishness, corruptness. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, prophet Isaiah quotes God for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. This is the case we're in. When we have Parliament meet up in Ottawa, or the Congress gets together in Washington, D.C., the thoughts of these politicians are not God's thoughts. God's thoughts are far above all of these things. Let's go to Isaiah 25, verse 1, comparing the way of what God understood to be the administration of justice. O Lord, thou art my God, I will exalt thee. Prophet Isaiah is writing. I will praise thy name, for thou hast done wonderful things. Your counsels of old are faithfulness and truth. See, what God has taught, these things represent faithfulness and truth. They are according to the reality of this world. God's laws are unchanging. He is an impartial judge. He doesn't care whether you're rich or you're poor, you're black or you're white, or any of the other things. God's mercy is available for those who want to follow his law, his ways. Yes, he is the judge. He administers justice, but he does it also with mercy for those for whom mercy is well deserved. Man after God's own heart, David, the king of Israel, eventually the shepherd king of Israel, who understood how great God's laws are, and there's a difference from what human beings do. Let's go to Psalm chapter 19, Psalm 19, verse 7. We'll read the difference. What is the difference between God's law, which is God's version of the house rules for humanity, what he sees as the way to order a society so that it will be just, be equitable, be fair. Psalm 19, verse 7. The law of the Lord is perfect. It converts the soul. It transforms the lives of people. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. God's statutes is when, God would look at a commandment and he'd say, okay, okay. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eye, so we can see where we're going. The fear of the Lord, that is the deep respect and honor of God and his teachings, is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, in a society where our politicians are undermining the currency of all over the world of the different people, so that, God's teachings are more desired than even gold, which people are flocking to these days as a store of value. Yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them, that is, by God's statutes, by his house rules that he set down in the scriptures for humanity, your servant is warned, David is saying. And in keeping them there is great reward. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Thinking we're doing some great thing when we're not, because God's law is, it's there for us to read so we can understand, so we don't make mistakes and get misled, especially when we have societies, our present legal system, they're framing oftentimes corruption and things that are contrary completely to the Word of God, God's law, won't have a good end. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me, not to be enslaved by their passions, by the greed, by the desire. Then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression. Many times these days, I think the societies and the leaders, to get the politicians to get elected, they promise and they'll pander to the basis of the instincts of the people. But these things won't give you a great reward if you get caught up in them. Keeping the Word of God, the law of God, it's not like the human laws. When we talk about, as a Christian, from a spiritual standpoint, keeping the law of God, God's law is pure. It makes wise the simple. It keeps us back from making bad mistakes in our life. We need to pay attention. We need to pay attention to them, and we need not to carry over when we read the Scripture, say, oh, that's God's law, and have this negative attitude that is far too often, because our experience with law in this contemporary society is oftentimes less than satisfactory. We have a system where, if you think you're winning when in actuality all you're doing is losing. Let's go to 1 John, in one of the general epistles of the Apostle John. For a Christian, we need to pay attention to God's Word. There are many who speak against God's law, who claim to be Christian, but it's a terrible mistake. But in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 2, read this in the Coulter translation, by this standard we know we love the children of God. See, we know we love our neighbors. We love the children of God. We are church brethren. And how do we know it? How do we know we love? When we love God and keep His commandments. By keeping His commandments, we show that we really love God. And we're not like the Pharisees. We're not these hypocrites who say a lot with their mouths but don't do what God wants them to do, who focus on the minors instead of the majors. By this standard we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. God's law, unlike our contemporary legal system that is far too often unfair, corrupt, illogical, ineffective, arbitrary, and sometimes downright silly, God's law will give us a good reward. It will help us to live a life in which, the outcome is going to be good. It teaches us the true meaning of right from wrong, so that we are in harmony with the reality of this universe, and will not be betrayed by people who frame laws that get them elected to make them popular by appealing to the basest passions of our society. God's law is not like this. If we want to take advantage of what the Scriptures offer and to have a relationship with God, we will approach Him. If we want to know that we love God, then we will keep His commandments. And His commandments truly are not burdensome. Till next time.